you have to believe his next statement, which is this famous quote where he said, "Stop trying to change your happiness. You're as likely to be able to change your happiness as to change your height," which is true. 80% of your height is determined based upon genes, the other 20% based upon nutrition and environment. If that was true for happiness, then all these books, all these researchers, all these attempts that we take to increase our levels of happiness is useless, because it was all determined when we were first born,
Right.
With our genes. What we've since discovered is those researchers were only half right, which I believe makes them fully wrong. What that means is that every baby is, and if you have multiple children, you've seen this before, some of them are born introverted or extroverted, and you haven't even had time to screw them up yet. They already have that predisposition, or some children just seem to be predisposed to being more positive or negative than the other children. That's based upon genes, and your genes do set an initial baseline of happiness. But what we discovered when we stopped just studying the average, because the average person does not fight their genes. So what we find is, on average, most people just go right towards their genes. But when you do what positive psychology attempts to do, which is to study outliers, what we found is, outliers being people that are not at the curve or not right at average, what we discovered is that people very much can change that baseline if they change their mindset or if they change their conscious habits. So what I do in my research and in my book is attempt to show the habits that actually scientifically create a change from that initial baseline. So regardless of where your genes have set you, or your environment, or your childhood upbringing up to this point, that we know scientifically how we can raise that baseline of happiness up.
All right, excellent. And then you also have the advantage of lots of neuroscience over the last 10, 20 years or whatever, and I'm sure that that's been a factor too. Am I correct?
You're absolutely right. We can actually track now. We can watch changes that are occurring in the brain based upon the ways that we live our lives in different ways. So one of the things I talk about in the book is something called the Tetris Effect, which is how our brains get stuck in these cognitive patterns. And we can watch them when people pick up life habits. We can see them create new neural networks in the brain, allowing them to create these patterns that become ingrained in their daily life. And what we're shooting for is that those patterns are based around optimism, or they're based around a cascade of success. So that when an individual starts to make some of these changes, what we find is, based upon their neurochemicals and based upon brain scans, we can actually watch these people become happier and happier.
Could you give an example of a pattern?
Sure, absolutely. So I mentioned the Tetris Effect. It's a funny story. The Tetris Effect I got based upon studies that were done where they found if you played Tetris for 5 hours in a row. Tetris is a video game.
Yeah, I like Tetris.
Yeah, it's great. It's a game where, if some of your listeners have not played it, it's where different shapes fall from the top of the screen and you have to rotate them in order to make straight lines. Well, what they found is if you hire Harvard Business School students and pay them to play Tetris for 5 hours in a row, that by the end of it, we got these hilarious reports of people walking into supermarkets and rearranging the bread on the shelf to make straight lines, or dreaming about how to make these straight lines out of shapes that they see around them on traffic patterns or in the world. What that just means is that when our brain does the same pattern for too long in a row, we can retain that pattern even when it's maladaptive. So if you play Tetris, it's great that you make straight lines, but if you're walking around on a daily basis, making straight lines out of everything is not necessarily helpful. What we found is that I was working with a group of tax auditors at KPMG, and what we found is many of these people were spending 8 to 14 hours a day looking through tax forms, looking for mistakes and errors, which made them great at their job until they had to manage a team, or they were thinking about how happy they felt at work. And suddenly their brain was focused not on all the good things. Their brain would actually scan not how to make straight lines, but they would scan for the negative, the hassles, the complaints, the errors first. And so what we wanted to do is see if we could change those people's patterns through which they viewed the world. One of the people that I worked with said that he was feeling very depressed at work and getting about 25% less work done than normal. So on a break at work, he made an Excel spreadsheet and wrote down a list of all the mistakes he felt like his wife had been making in their relationship, and then he printed out the spreadsheet and brought the spreadsheet home to his wife, and then he said, well, to my ex-wife. And I'm listening to this guy tell the story, and it was exactly what we were seeing with the Tetris Effect, that if you look at the world looking for mistakes and errors and negative things first, your brain cannot do two things at once. It can't at the same time then scan the world for the positive. So what we had those managers do at KPMG is we had them just every morning when they woke up and got into work, just write down 3 things that they were grateful for. It had to be something new each day, like all 3 had to be new gratitudes, and they had to be specific. They couldn't just say, I'm grateful for my health. They have to say why they're grateful for their health. What we find is in the research that was done on this, and we've had research based upon this for about 10 years, where they found that if individuals do this for a period of 21 days in a row, it creates a pattern of starting your day on a neural track, scanning the world not for the negative but for the positive. And just like those people who played Tetris for too long, that individuals that do this actually start to scan the world with a different Tetris effect or a different pattern, so that they're not looking for all the hassles, the complaints, the problems first. They're scanning for the positive, the things that make them grateful, the things that provide meaning in their life. And what we found is that increases not only their job satisfaction, that increases their job performance as well. They become better leaders. They're more productive. They stay at an organization longer. Their clients like them better. Their sales increase. A whole host of benefits that wrap into that happiness advantage we were talking about. So the pattern that we were changing is if you have a limited amount of resources for scanning the world with your brain, are you looking for the negative first or are you looking for the positive? And if you look for the positive, not only are you happier, you become more productive as well.
I am totally enjoying listening to this. Thank you, Shawn. Shawn Achor here. We're discussing the happiness advantage, the 7 principles of positive psychology that fuel success and performance at work. Well, you know, one of the things that we have heard through our lifetime is that there are people who look at the world as, you know, half full or half empty.
Right.
And so now science is showing that that is true, and you can change the way you look at the world with practice because you can change the neural pathways in your brain, correct?
That's correct.
But it takes practice and it takes discipline, but it works.
Right. You know, one of the things I say oftentimes in my lectures is that happiness is not something that happens to you. Happiness is actually a work ethic. It requires us to train our brains just like we train our brains in school, or that we exercise, or we go to trainings to learn about how to do tax forms. What we're interested in is learning the ways in which our brain works so that we can find out how to get our brains to work best.
Excellent. So one of the things that I want to mention here is that part of the premise of my program, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that I really like to focus on the things that are working. So I come at this from that perspective. And there are so many things that we are capable of doing, and we can change our happiness level. And it's something that I've learned more and more over the years, like I said, particularly being in contact with so many different experts on this field. And what I love about your work is that it's based on a lot of research and it's based on science, and you're showing results.
Yeah, I think that's the part that excites me most. I started this research or started in this field almost through the back door. I was at Harvard Divinity School studying, comparing Christian and Buddhist ethics. So what I was studying was how you see the world, the lens to which you see the world. How does that change the way that we decide to live in it? How does that change what makes you feel happy, your joy, what makes you wake up in the morning, what causes you to make the decisions, the ethical decisions that you do? And when I was doing that, people in the psychology department said, we would love to ask those same questions, but we'd like to do it from a scientific perspective. So what we began to do was to ask questions about meaning, happiness, joy, optimism, what causes us to wake up in the morning, but doing it to see if we could predict then changes to the brain or changes to the way that we live our lives or any of those business or educational outcomes that we were interested in. And what we're finding is a lot of our research is reconfirming all the things we heard from most of the major